Can you imagine dedicating your entire existence to protecting those you love, only to have them turn against you when your conscience finally demands the truth be told? The kind of betrayal that doesn't just wound your heart, but threatens to steal your very mind and soul. My name is Gloria, and for 43 years, I carried a terrible secret that nearly destroyed me from the inside out. I became the silent pillar, holding up my family's pristine reputation, sacrificing my own peace of mind to protect them from the consequences of a horrific crime we'd covered up together when I was younger. I told myself it was for the greater good, that preserving their futures was worth my sleepless nights and tormented conscience. But as old age settled over me and my time grew short, the weight of that buried truth became unbearable. My conscience screamed for confession, for the chance to find peace before I faced whatever comes after this life. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my family I could no longer live with the lie, they revealed their true nature with chilling efficiency. My siblings, who called themselves the family council, moved swiftly to silence me. They gaslit me, threatened me, and when those tactics failed, they began something far more sinister, systematically drugging me to steal my memories and my voice, robbing me of my last chance at redemption. But in that suffocating prison of my own home, as my mind began to blur and fade, I managed one final act of defiance. Hidden in an old family heirloom was my desperate plea for justice, a package containing the truth they were so desperate to bury. The walls of my Victorian home, which had sheltered 3 generations of my family, transformed overnight from a sanctuary of cherished memories into the bars of an elegant prison. The familiar rooms that had once echoed with laughter and holiday celebrations now felt like chambers designed to contain and silence me, their floral wallpaper and antique furniture becoming witnesses to my systematic erasure. My phone disappeared, first quietly removed during what my brother William claimed was routine maintenance of my living space. When I asked about it, my sister-in-law Margaret smiled, with the patient condescension reserved for confused elderly relatives, and assured me that I'd simply misplaced it, that it would turn up eventually. But days passed, then weeks, and no phone appeared. My trusted caregiver, Sarah, who had been with me for 5 years and knew all my routines and preferences, was abruptly dismissed without explanation. In her place appeared a woman named Janet, whose cold eyes and professional distance made it clear that her loyalty lay not with my comfort, but with whoever was paying her salary. Janet spoke in clipped, efficient phrases and seemed to view me as a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving of respect and care. Every attempt I made to speak about the past, about the secret that had haunted our family for decades, was met with knowing glances between Janet and whoever else happened to be present. They would exchange looks that said, "Here she goes again," and respond with forced smiles and gentle redirections, as if I were a child spinning fantasies rather than an adult trying to unburden her conscience of a terrible truth. The isolation was suffocating in its completeness. My few remaining friends from church and the garden club found their calls mysteriously unanswered or intercepted by family members who offered smooth explanations about my need for rest and my declining health. When Mrs. Patterson from next door tried to visit, she was politely but firmly turned away with assurances that I was not up for company and that the family would pass along her well wishes. I found myself drowning in a profound silence that seemed to press against my eardrums and make my thoughts echo strangely in my head. The secret that had gnawed at my soul for 4 decades grew heavier in this forced solitude, but every time I tried to speak of it, my words were dismissed as the ramblings of an aging mind, rather than the testimony of someone who had lived with guilt for longer than most people could imagine. The family council, led by my younger brother William and his wife Margaret, operated with the chilling efficiency of people who had planned for this contingency long before it became necessary to implement their strategy. They controlled every aspect of my daily existence with a precision that revealed months or perhaps years of preparation for the day when my conscience might overcome my loyalty to family reputation. My schedule became their creation, designed not around my comfort or preferences, but around their need to maintain complete control over my interactions with the outside world. Meals arrived at times they determined containing medications they claimed were necessary for my health, but which left me feeling foggy and disconnected from my own thoughts. My mail was intercepted and sorted by Margaret, who assured me that she was simply helping me manage the overwhelming correspondence that older people sometimes found stressful. When distant relatives called during holidays or tried to arrange visits, William would smoothly intervene with carefully crafted explanations about my poor health and need for quiet recovery time. He painted a picture of a frail elderly woman whose family was lovingly protecting her from the strain of social obligations, when the reality was that they were systematically cutting me off from anyone who might listen to what I desperately needed to say. My nieces and nephews, raised on the prosperity that our family's untarnished reputation had provided, served as direct enforcers of their parents' will. During their infrequent but orchestrated visits, they would speak to me with the patronizing kindness reserved for mental patients, their voices artificially bright as they made comments about my confusion and memory problems that served to establish a narrative of cognitive decline for anyone who might be listening. These young adults, who had benefited their entire lives from the secret I had carried, now acted as if my attempts to speak the truth were symptoms of dementia rather than the desperate efforts of someone trying to clear her conscience before death. Or their arrogance was breathtaking in its casual cruelty, their sense of entitlement so complete that they viewed my suffering as a minor inconvenience compared to the potential damage my honesty might cause to their social standing. Despite the mounting evidence of my family's calculated betrayal, despite the growing dread that settled over me like a heavy blanket, a stubborn sliver of denial persisted in my heart. These were the people I had sacrificed everything to protect, the children and grandchildren whose futures I had prioritized over my own peace of mind. Surely, they couldn't truly be orchestrating this systematic silencing of the woman who had given up her own chance at absolution for their sake. I clung desperately to fleeting memories of shared Christmases and birthday celebrations of times when William had sought my advice about important decisions, and Margaret had thanked me for my support during difficult periods in their marriage. I tried to rationalize their current actions as misguided attempts to protect me from what they saw as the harmful effects of dwelling on painful memories from the distant past. Perhaps they genuinely believed that forcing me to remain silent about the covered-up crime was an act of love rather than cruelty. Maybe they had convinced themselves that my desire to confess was evidence of mental deterioration rather than moral clarity. I desperately wanted to believe that the bonds of family loyalty that had defined my entire adult life still meant something to them, even as my grip on hope and reality itself felt increasingly tenuous. But each passing day brought fresh evidence that my family viewed my conscience as a threat to be neutralized rather than a sacred obligation to be respected. The medications that left me drowsy and confused the isolation that cut me off from potential allies, the systematic dismissal of my attempts to speak all of it, pointed to a level of premeditation that was terrifying in its implications. I was becoming a prisoner in my own life, held captive not by strangers, but by the very people whose welfare had motivated every major decision I'd made for over 4 decades. The irony was crushing. I had protected them from the consequences of our shared secret, only to discover that they were willing to destroy me, to keep that protection in place permanently. As weeks turned into months under my family's control, the thin veneer of loving care that had initially disguised their true intentions began to crumble, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath their concerned facades. The comfortable routines they had initially maintained, regular meals, pleasant conversation, gentle assistance with daily tasks, gradually gave way to something far more sinister and deliberately cruel. The new caregivers who I now understood were following explicit instructions. From William and Margaret began implementing what could only be described as systematic neglect designed to break my spirit and accelerate my decline. My meals, once served promptly and with attention to my dietary preferences, now arrived hours late and consisted of bland institutional food that seemed calculated to remind me of my powerlessness rather than nourish my aging body. I was left alone for increasingly long periods, sitting in my bedroom chair with nothing but my tortured thoughts for company, while the sounds of normal life continued in other parts of the house. The caregivers would disappear for hours at a time, claiming they were running errands or attending to other duties, leaving me unable to perform basic tasks like reaching medications or accessing the bathroom without assistance. When I called out for help during these abandonment periods, my pleas were often ignored entirely or met with irritated responses about my demanding behavior and need to be more patient. The message was clear. I existed entirely at their sufferance, and any complaints about my treatment would only result in worse conditions. The medication regimen that had begun as subtle mental clouding escalated into something far more aggressive and debilitating. The pills I was forced to take multiple times daily left me drowsy and disoriented, unable to maintain coherent thoughts for more than a few minutes at a time. My once sharp mind, which had managed household finances and social obligations well into my 70s, began to feel like a radio, with poor reception thoughts fading in and out through static I couldn't clear. Most terrifying of all was the practice of locking me in my bedroom for my own safety during periods when visitors might arrive or when the family wanted to conduct business without my interference. I would hear the key turn in the lock from the outside, followed by the distant sounds of normal conversation and activity that I was no longer permitted to participate in or witness. During these periods of imprisonment, I could hear my nieces and nephews laughing in the garden or discussing their plans for weekend activities, their voices carrying a casual cruelty that made it clear my suffering was not just acceptable to them, but perhaps even amusing. They spoke about me as if I were already dead, making plans for after Aunt Gloria, with an eagerness that revealed how much my continued existence inconvenienced their lives. The shattering moment of complete realization came during one of my increasingly rare periods of mental clarity, when the effects of the medications temporarily lifted enough for me to think with something approaching my former sharpness. I had been trying to explain to William, as I had countless times before, why I needed to speak the truth about what had happened all those years ago, why my conscience could no longer bear the weight of our shared lie. Instead of the patient dismissal, I had grown accustomed to William's mask of concern, slipped completely revealing the cold anger that had been simmering beneath his performance of familial duty. his face contorted with frustration and contempt as he snapped at me with a viciousness that took my breath away. "It's just your old age, Gloria," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're confused. You're not thinking clearly. There's nothing to tell because nothing happened that matters anymore. Think about the family. Think about our reputation. Do you want to destroy everything we've built with these delusions? Do you want to ruin the lives of people who love you?" The coldness in his eyes as he spoke these words, the absolute contempt for my suffering, and the complete dismissal of my moral anguish shattered the last fragments of denial I had been clinging to. This wasn't about protecting my health or managing the effects of aging. This was about preserving their social standing and financial security at any cost, even if that cost was my sanity and my soul. The painful memories that flooded back in the aftermath of this confrontation felt like reliving a nightmare I had been trying to forget for over 4 decades. I remembered the horror of that night when everything changed, when a moment of reckless behavior by one of my family members had resulted in a death that we had all agreed to cover up to protect what we called the family's future. I recalled the agonizing weeks that followed when we had crafted our lie and practiced our story until it became second nature, when we had buried the evidence and sworn each other to secrecy with the solemnity of people who understood they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. I had been younger then, more willing to believe that family loyalty justified any sacrifice, more convinced that the greater good required individual suffering. For decades, I had carried the weight of that decision, denying myself the peace that comes from honest confession, burying my own need for absolution under layers of rationalization about protecting the innocent family members who had been children when the crime was committed. I had told myself that my guilt was a small price to pay for ensuring that my nieces and nephews could grow up with clean reputations and unlimited opportunities. But now, seeing how casually these same family members were willing to destroy my mind and steal my remaining years to perpetuate the very lie I had suffered to maintain, I understood the full scope of what I had sacrificed. My peace of mind, my relationship with God, my sense of myself as a moral person, all of it had been traded away to protect people who viewed my conscience as a threat to their comfort rather than a sacred obligation to be honored. When I tried during another brief moment of clarity to confront Margaret about the increasing doses of medication that were stealing my ability to think coherently, her response was delivered with the kind of calm, practiced ease that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation many times in her mind. "We're doing this for your own good, Aunt Gloria," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "You're simply not well enough to be making these kinds of accusations against your own family. Think about how it looks. Think about the scandal it would cause. This is for everyone's protection, including yours." Her words, delivered with a placid smile that never reached her eyes, confirmed what I had been desperately trying not to believe. My family had made a calculated decision to sacrifice my mental faculties and my remaining time on earth to protect their reputation. They had weighed my need for spiritual peace against their desire for continued social standing, and they had chosen to destroy me rather than face the consequences of our shared past. The forced submission that followed this realization was more devastating than physical torture could have been. The increased medication dosages left my mind clouded almost constantly, my thoughts becoming disjointed fragments that I couldn't hold together long enough to form coherent plans or meaningful resistance. My body felt heavy and unresponsive as if I were trying to move through thick honey that slowed every gesture and made every task monumentally difficult. I was losing myself piece by piece, my memories fading like photographs left too long in sunlight, my personality dissolving under the chemical assault my own family was orchestrating. The woman who had once managed complex social obligations and family finances was becoming a shuffling shell who couldn't remember what day it was or why she felt such persistent sadness. The cruelest part was the moments of partial clarity that occasionally broke through the pharmaceutical fog, brief periods when I could see exactly what was being done to me, but felt powerless to resist or escape. During these interludes, I would understand with perfect clarity that I was being systematically erased by people who had claimed to love me, that my final years were being stolen to protect secrets that should have been confessed decades ago. The final cruelty that pushed me beyond the boundaries of what human spirit can endure came during one of my brief periods of semi-lucidity, when the medication fog lifted just enough for me to witness a conversation that revealed the complete extent of my family's callousness. I was sitting in my bedroom chair, supposedly resting, but actually struggling to maintain consciousness against the pharmaceutical haze, when I heard voices drifting up from the living room below. William and his children were discussing the disposal of my personal belongings with the casual efficiency of people conducting an estate sale while the deceased was still breathing. They spoke about my treasured antique writing desk, a magnificent piece that had been passed down through 4 generations of our family, as if it were nothing more than inconvenient furniture taking up valuable space. The old desk will bring a decent price at auction. I heard my nephew David saying, his voice carrying the kind of satisfied calculation that made my blood run cold. It's real mahogany, probably worth several thousand if we find the right buyer. All that old paperwork she keeps in the drawers is just trash, of course, but the furniture itself has value. My great-granddaughter Jennifer laughed at something I couldn't quite hear, then added, "Honestly, I don't know why she's held on to all that worthless old junk for so long. It's not like any of those musty papers mean anything to anyone. We should probably just burn the whole lot and be done with it." The casual dismissal of my most precious possessions, the desk where I had written love letters to my late husband, where I had penned my thoughts during the darkest periods of carrying our family secret, where I had spent countless hours trying to find the words to capture my feelings about the burden I carried, ignited something fierce and desperate within my fading consciousness. That writing desk wasn't just furniture to me. It was the physical repository of my entire emotional life, the place where I had wrestled with my conscience and tried to make sense of the impossible choices I had been forced to make. The idea that they would casually destroy the contents and sell the piece to strangers felt like the final desecration of everything I had ever been or hoped to be. But more than the sentimental violation, their conversation revealed something that sent ice through my veins. They had no idea that hidden within that desk were documents that could destroy them all if discovered by the right person. In their arrogance and assumption that I was too far gone to pose any threat, they were planning to dispose of evidence they didn't even know existed. This realization plunged me into the deepest despair I had ever experienced. My memories were fleeting shadows that I could barely grasp, my thoughts, scattered fragments that refused to coalesce into anything resembling coherent planning. I felt myself losing grip on who I was, my very identity dissolving under the constant assault of medications and psychological torture. The agony of being unable to speak the truth that had tormented me for 4 decades, combined with the knowledge that my own family was systematically erasing me to protect their comfort, created a suffering that went beyond physical pain into something that felt like the dissolution of my soul itself. I lay in my bed during the long, empty hours, adrift in a hazy fog that made it difficult to distinguish between waking and sleeping, between memory and hallucination. The weight of profound injustice pressed down on me like a physical force, making even breathing feel like an enormous effort that I wasn't sure I wanted to continue making. In my darkest moments, I contemplated simply letting go, allowing the pharmaceutical tide to carry me away from consciousness permanently. The thought of surrendering to the oblivion they were forcing upon me held a certain terrible appeal, promising an end to the unbearable tension between my need to confess and my inability to speak. But even as my mind struggled against the chemical restraints they had placed upon it, some deeper part of my consciousness, perhaps the part that had kept me alive through 4 decades of guilt and remorse, refused to accept total defeat. In a brief, desperate moment of clarity that cut through the mental fog like lightning, my eyes focused on something I hadn't noticed in weeks, the old family photo album sitting on a high shelf, dusty and apparently forgotten. That leather-bound album filled with pictures from happier times before our family's great crime had poisoned everything we touched suddenly became a beacon of possibility in my dimming world. It was a relic from an era when truth still mattered in our household, a tangible link to the people we had been before we became conspirators in covering up murder. But more importantly, it was something they had overlooked in their systematic cataloging and disposal of my possessions. In their certainty that I was too far gone to pose any threat, they had failed to remember the precautions I had taken years earlier, during moments when I had briefly considered telling the truth. The memory came back to me in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle, assembling themselves against the pharmaceutical haze myself, perhaps 5 years earlier, during a particularly bad period when the guilt had nearly overwhelmed my ability to function, carefully placing certain items inside that album for safekeeping. I had been planning even then for the possibility that someday I might find the courage to speak, and I had wanted to ensure that evidence existed to support my confession. With an effort that felt like lifting mountains, fighting against the lethargy and confusion that the medications created, I somehow managed to shuffle across my room to the bookshelf. My trembling fingers fumbled with the stiff clasp of the album, my vision swimming, as I tried to focus on the task. Hidden among the yellowing photographs of family gatherings and childhood celebrations, images of innocence from before we became criminals, was a small, carefully sealed package. Inside were handwritten notes detailing the original crime in my own precise script, including dates, locations, and the names of everyone involved in the cover-up. There was also a small brass key that unlocked a safety deposit box I had maintained secretly for years, containing additional evidence that would corroborate my written account. This was my dead drop, my final act of defiance against their attempts to steal both my mind and my truth. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to ensure that even if they succeeded in destroying me completely, some record would remain of what had really happened and who was responsible for perpetuating the lies that had poisoned our family for nearly half a century. The act of retrieving those hidden materials required every ounce of strength and willpower I still possessed and left me exhausted and shaking from the effort. But for the first time in months, I felt something other than despair, a grim satisfaction that I had managed one final gesture of defiance against the family members who had decided my conscience was less important than their comfort. As I carefully replaced the album on its shelf, trying not to alert the caregivers to what I had done, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. They could continue drugging me. They could steal my remaining years. They could even succeed in erasing my mind completely, but they could no longer silence the truth forever because I had ensured that evidence would survive even if I did not. With the hidden package secured and my secret act of defiance complete, my struggle transformed into something purely internal and infinitely more challenging than any physical battle I had ever fought. Every coherent thought, every moment of clear memory became a precious commodity that I had to guard jealously against the pharmaceutical assault my family was waging against my consciousness. The medications they forced upon me created a constant fog that made thinking feel like trying to navigate through thick cotton batting. Simple concepts that had once been automatic, remembering names, following conversations, understanding the sequence of events, now required enormous effort and concentration that left me exhausted after even brief periods of mental clarity. But I forced myself to focus on the package hidden in the photo album, using its weight and significance as an anchor to whatever remained of my rational mind. During the brief windows when the drug-induced haze lifted slightly, I would repeat to myself the crucial details I needed to remember: the name of the lawyer who held the duplicate key to my safety deposit box, the location of the bank where additional evidence was stored, the contact information for distant relatives who might be willing to listen if my story ever reached them. The effort required to maintain these memories against the chemical tide, trying to wash them away, was like trying to hold sand in cupped hands during a hurricane. Each detail felt precious and fragile, liable to slip away the moment my concentration wavered or the next dose of medication took effect. I found myself creating mental exercises, repetitive patterns that might help preserve the essential information even as other memories disappeared. I would recite my late husband's social security number, which I knew was written in my hidden notes. I would visualize the face of my childhood friend Eleanor, who had moved away decades ago, but whose phone number was listed among my emergency contacts in the sealed envelope. These fragments of information became my lifeline to sanity proof that somewhere beneath the pharmaceutical fog, the real Gloria still existed and was fighting to preserve what mattered most. Each successful recall felt like a small victory against the systematic erasure my family was orchestrating, evidence that they hadn't yet succeeded in completely destroying my capacity for independent thought. My family, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to my small act of rebellion, their arrogance and certainty about their control, blinding them to the possibility that I might still possess any capacity for resistance. They moved through my house with the confidence of people who believed they had already won the war, discussing my condition and their plans for my future, as if I were already too far gone to understand or remember their conversations. They dismissed my occasional moments of clarity as nothing more than agitation or sundowning, medical terms they wielded like weapons to justify increasing my medication whenever I showed signs of cognitive awareness that made them uncomfortable. When I managed to speak coherently or ask pointed questions about my situation, they would exchange knowing looks and make notes for the caregivers about adjusting my pharmaceutical regimen. Their conversations about streamlining my affairs grew more frequent and detailed, revealing the extent to which they had already begun liquidating my assets and preparing for a future in which I would have no voice in decisions about my own life. They spoke openly about selling my house, disposing of my personal belongings, and transferring my remaining financial resources to accounts they could control more easily. The contempt in their voices when they discussed these plans was palpable, their words revealing how completely they had dehumanized me in their minds. I wasn't their sister or aunt anymore. I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved through chemical restraint and legal manipulation. Despite the relentless pharmaceutical assault on my consciousness, I managed one small victory that felt enormous in the context of my increasingly limited world. During a rare moment, when the regular caregiver had been replaced by a temporary substitute who seemed less vigilant about monitoring my every movement, I seized an opportunity that might not come again. The new caregiver, a young woman who appeared more interested in her phone than in watching me, had stepped out of my room to prepare my afternoon medications. In that precious window of unsupervised time, I managed to shuffle to my old desk and briefly glimpse a contact list that had somehow escaped my family's systematic purge of my personal papers. My vision was blurry and my hands shook terribly, but I was able to make out the phone number of my late husband's nephew, James, who lived several states away and had maintained only minimal contact with our branch of the family. More importantly, I could see the address of the law firm that had helped me establish the safety deposit box years earlier, information that might prove crucial if anyone ever discovered my hidden evidence. The victory felt both triumphant and hollow, a momentary break in the suffocating control my family had established over every aspect of my existence. For those few precious minutes, I felt like myself, again capable, alert, able to take action on my own behalf. But the feeling was immediately overshadowed by the terrifying reality of how rare such moments had become and how quickly they were slipping away from me. When the caregiver returned and found me away from my designated chair, her reaction was swift and professional. She guided me back to my seat with firm efficiency and made careful notes in the chart that documented my daily behavior for my family's review. I knew that this small act of independence would result in increased surveillance and probably stronger medications designed to prevent future episodes of unauthorized activity. My family's retaliation for this minor display of agency was swift and comprehensive. They escalated their gaslighting campaign, explicitly instructing all caregivers that I was prone to wild fabrications and delusional episodes that required careful monitoring and immediate intervention. Any statement I made about the past, any question I asked about my current situation, any expression of distress or confusion was to be documented as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. William began making dark hints about the possibility of considering other arrangements. If my behavior didn't improve euphemistic language that I understood to mean forced institutionalization, in a facility where I would have even less opportunity to resist their control or communicate with the outside world. The threat was delivered with the same calm, reasonable tone he might use to discuss changing insurance policies, but its implications were terrifying. They also began spreading carefully crafted stories to distant relatives and family friends about my rapid mental deterioration, creating a narrative that would discredit any future revelations that might emerge from my hidden evidence. According to their version of events, I was becoming increasingly paranoid and delusional, prone to making wild accusations against family members who were sacrificing their own comfort to care for me. These character assassination campaigns were conducted with the same methodical efficiency they brought to every aspect of my imprisonment, designed to ensure that if my secret somehow survived my death, it would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a senile woman, rather than the testimony of someone who had carried a terrible burden for over 4 decades. The weight of this escalating conflict settled over me like a suffocating blanket, leaving me feeling weary in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I was fighting a war where every small victory brought immediate and overwhelming retaliation, where my only weapons were fragments of memory and a hidden package that might never be discovered by anyone who would believe its contents. Yet beneath the crushing sadness and the grim determination that had become my daily companions, there remained a flicker of something that felt almost like vindication. Despite their pharmaceutical assault, despite their systematic isolation and gaslighting, despite their absolute control over my physical existence, I had managed to preserve the truth in a form that might outlive both them and me. It was a fragile hope, dependent on chance discoveries and the goodwill of strangers, but it was also proof that some part of my essential self remained unbroken, despite everything they had done to destroy it. The supervised outing came without warning, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain the illusion that I was receiving proper care from loving family members who were concerned about my well-being. Margaret announced it with the bright false cheer that had become her signature tone when discussing my situation, explaining that fresh air and a change of scenery would be good for my mental state. I was dressed in my best coat and positioned in a wheelchair despite my protests that I could still walk short distances, a detail that served their narrative about my declining physical capabilities, while ensuring I couldn't wander away or move independently during our excursion. The wheelchair was pushed by my nephew David, who maintained a stream of cheerful commentary about the weather and local events that required no response from me and allowed him to appear solicitous while actually preventing any meaningful conversation. Our destination was the Old Town Square, a place that held significance far beyond what my family members realized. It was here 43 years ago that the tragic accident had occurred, the moment when everything in our lives had changed forever, and we had made the collective decision to cover up a death rather than face the consequences of what had happened. The same clock tower still dominated the square, its Victorian Gothic architecture unchanged despite the modern shops and restaurants that now surrounded it. As we approached the memorial fountain where the accident had taken place, I could hear the familiar chimes marking the half hour, the same sound that had been echoing across the square on that terrible night when a young woman's life had been cut short by our family's recklessness. A wave of nostalgia and grief washed over me with unexpected force, mingling the sharp pain of remembered guilt with a crushing sorrow for the innocent life that had been lost and the decades of lies that had followed. The victim had been barely 20, a college student walking home from her job at the local library, someone who had never done anything to deserve what happened to her, or the cover-up that had denied her family the truth about her death. My family members, oblivious to the profound emotional resonance this place held for me, chattered idly about mundane topics with the casual indifference of people taking a pleasant stroll through a location that held no particular significance. They made comments about the new boutique that had opened, where the old hardware store used to be debated, whether the fountain's renovation had improved its appearance, and discussed their dinner plans with the kind of trivial concerns that suggested they had completely forgotten or chosen to forget what had happened here. When I tried to speak about the weight of memory that this place carried about the young woman whose death had shaped our family's trajectory for over 4 decades, they quickly intervened with patronizing corrections about my wandering thoughts and gentle redirections toward safer topics of conversation. "Now, Aunt Gloria, let's not get all worked up about old stories," Margaret said with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "You know how confused you get when you dwell on the past. Let's focus on enjoying this beautiful day instead." Their casual dismissal of the tragedy that had defined our family's darkest secret, Their ability to stand in the very spot where an innocent person had died, without showing any sign of recognition or remorse, highlighted the complete moral bankruptcy that had allowed them to drug and imprison me, rather than face the consequences of our shared guilt. As David pushed my wheelchair along the familiar pathways of the square, pointing out changes that had occurred since my last visit, and maintaining his performance of attentive family care, I noticed a figure approaching from the direction of the old library building. It was my cousin Rachel, the daughter of my late Uncle Thomas, someone who had been estranged from our family for years, precisely because she had never accepted the official story about what had happened that night. Rachel had been a teenager when the accident occurred, old enough to remember the inconsistencies in our account, but young enough to be dismissed when she asked uncomfortable questions about the timeline and circumstances of the young woman's death. Over the years, her persistent inquiries and refusal to accept our fabricated version of events had made her persona non grata at family gatherings. Her invitations to holidays and reunions quietly discontinued when her presence became too uncomfortable. Our eyes met across the square, and I saw in her expression a flicker of recognition that went beyond simple acknowledgement of a family member. There was sorrow there, and understanding, and something that looked almost like knowing sympathy for my current situation. She had heard about my declining health through family networks, but seeing me confined to a wheelchair and obviously heavily medicated seemed to confirm suspicions she had probably harbored about my family's treatment of inconvenient truth-tellers. My niece Jennifer, who had been walking alongside the wheelchair, immediately noticed the direction of my gaze and quickly steered our little procession away from any potential interaction with Rachel. Her movement was smooth and practice, suggesting that avoiding certain family members had become a routine part of managing my public appearances. But as she guided us toward a different section of the square, Jennifer couldn't resist making her own subtle threat disguised as caring concern. She leaned down close to my ear, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that made my skin crawl, and delivered a warning that was unmistakably clear despite its superficially solicitous tone. Auntie Gloria, remember what the doctor said about getting overexcited when we're out in public? We don't want you to have one of your spells again, do we? You know how upset you get when you see people from the old days and start getting confused about things that happened so long ago. Her words were carefully chosen to sound like medical advice to any casual observer, but the squeeze she gave my arm as she spoke and the coldness in her eyes when she looked at me made it clear that this was a threat rather than a suggestion. She was reminding me of the consequences of any attempt to communicate with Rachel or anyone else who might be willing to listen to what I desperately needed to say. The casual cruelty of using my own confused mental state as a weapon against me, of turning my pharmaceutical imprisonment into evidence of my unreliability, revealed the sophisticated nature of their psychological campaign. They had created a perfect system where any attempt I made to resist or seek help would be interpreted as further proof of my deteriorating condition, rather than evidence of their systematic abuse. As we continued our circuit of the square, Jennifer reveled in her demonstration of control, making additional comments about my need to stay calm and avoid getting worked up about things that were too confusing for me to understand properly. Her false concern was a form of taunting a way of asserting her power over my ability to speak or interact with others while maintaining the appearance of loving family care. But even as Jennifer tightened her grip on my arm and steered me away from any possibility of meaningful human connection, I felt something stirring within the fog of my drugged consciousness. The sight of Rachel, the memory of what this place had witnessed, the weight of the truth that I carried all of it, combined to create a moment of clarity that cut through the pharmaceutical haze like a blade. I met Jennifer's gaze directly, my eyes dry and steady, despite the tremor in my hands, and spoke with a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried the conviction of someone who had endured too much to be completely broken. "Some truths," I murmured the words, coming from a place deeper than conscious thought, "cannot be buried by pretty words or forgotten by convenient silence." As I spoke, I quietly touched the outline of the hidden package through my coat pocket, a gesture so subtle that Jennifer didn't notice it, but which reminded me that I had taken action to preserve what they were so desperate to destroy. It was a small act of defiance, invisible to my captors, but profound in its significance to me, proof that some essential part of who I was remained unbroken despite everything they had done to erase my identity and silence my conscience. As my physical condition continued to deteriorate under the relentless assault of medications, and my mental faculties became increasingly compromised by the pharmaceutical fog my family maintained around my consciousness, they began taking steps to formalize the control they had been exercising informally for months. The guardianship proceedings they initiated represented the final phase of their campaign to silence me permanently, transforming their unofficial imprisonment into a legal framework that would give them absolute authority over every aspect of my remaining existence. The process began with a series of medical evaluations conducted by doctors who had been carefully selected by my family physicians, whose conclusions had been predetermined by the narrative my brother and sister-in-law had constructed about my declining mental state. These supposed experts examined me during periods when my medication levels were at their highest, ensuring that I appeared confused, disoriented, and incapable of rational thought or decision-making. Each consultation felt like a public stripping away of my autonomy, a formal acknowledgement that I was no longer considered competent to manage my own affairs or make decisions about my own welfare. The doctors spoke about me in the third person, even when I was sitting directly in front of them discussing my presentation and cognitive deficits, as if I were a specimen to be studied, rather than a human being whose opinions and preferences might have value. The legal documents that accompanied these evaluations were written in language that transformed a lifetime of independent living into evidence of incompetence, describing my desire to confess our family's secret as persistent delusional ideation, and my resistance to their control as oppositional behavior consistent with cognitive decline. Every aspect of my personality and history was reinterpreted through the lens of mental illness, creating a legal fiction that bore no resemblance to the woman I had actually been before their campaign of systematic abuse began. My family's attorneys, working in coordination with the medical professionals they had selected, presented a comprehensive case for the necessity of full guardianship that painted me as a danger to myself and potentially to others. They submitted carefully edited recordings of my attempts to discuss the family secret, removing all context and presenting my words as evidence of paranoid delusions rather than the testimony of someone trying to unburden her conscience of a terrible truth. The most devastating aspect of this legal assault was the parade of witnesses they produced to testify about my supposed mental deterioration and erratic behavior. Caregivers who had been paid to implement their campaign of psychological torture now appeared in court to describe my aggressive outbursts and reality distortion, presenting my resistance to their abuse as evidence of cognitive impairment rather than normal human responses to systematic mistreatment. They brought in former neighbors and acquaintances who had been fed carefully crafted stories about my declining condition, people who testified with apparent sincerity about their concerns for my welfare based on secondhand accounts of behavior they had never actually witnessed. These character witnesses painted a picture of a once competent woman whose mind had deteriorated to the point where she required constant supervision and protection from her own poor judgment. Most cruel of all were the distorted medical reports that transformed the effects of their pharmaceutical abuse into evidence of organic brain disease, describing the confusion and memory loss caused by excessive medication as symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The very drugs they had been using to cloud my thinking were now presented as necessary treatments for conditions that existed only because of their intervention. But the legal system, despite its flaws and susceptibility to manipulation by those with resources and connections, occasionally produces moments of unexpected clarity that can disrupt even the most carefully orchestrated campaigns of deception. Such a moment came during what should have been a routine interview with a court-appointed social worker named Patricia Williams, a woman whose job was to provide an independent assessment of my condition and living situation. Patricia had spent decades working with elderly clients and their families, and she possessed the kind of professional intuition that comes from years of observing the dynamics between caregivers and those in their charge. When she arrived at my house for what my family expected to be a perfunctory visit that would rubber stamp their guardianship petition, she brought with her a fresh perspective that wasn't clouded by months of exposure to their carefully constructed narrative. During our interview, which took place in my bedroom under the watchful supervision of Margaret and one of the paid caregivers, something extraordinary happened. For reasons I still don't fully understand, perhaps the stress of the legal proceedings had disrupted my medication schedule, or perhaps some deeper part of my consciousness was fighting to surface my mind, cleared with startling suddenness, like fog lifting from a landscape to reveal details that had been hidden for hours. In that moment of unexpected lucidity, I found myself able to think, with something approaching my former sharpness, to see my situation with the kind of clarity that had been stolen from me for months. And in that crystal clear instant, I realized that this might be my only opportunity to communicate with someone who wasn't part of my family's conspiracy to silence me. I couldn't speak directly about the hidden evidence without alerting my captors to its existence, but I could make a gesture so subtle that they wouldn't recognize its significance, while hoping that someone with professional training in detecting abuse might understand what I was trying to communicate. With movements so small they appeared almost accidental, I indicated the old photo album on its shelf, my eyes meeting Patricia's for just a moment in a way that I hoped conveyed the desperate urgency of someone trying to send a message without being detected. Patricia, whose professional experience had taught her to recognize the signs of elder abuse, even in situations where victims couldn't speak freely, noticed both my gesture and the excessive level of supervision my family maintained over our interaction. She observed the way Margaret answered questions directed at me, the manner in which the caregiver positioned herself to monitor my every word and movement, and the subtle but unmistakable atmosphere of control and intimidation that permeated my living space. The combination of her professional instincts and my desperate silent plea created what legal professionals call a red flag moment, an instance when someone trained to protect vulnerable adults recognizes that something is fundamentally wrong with a situation that appears normal on the surface. Patricia's report to the court was carefully worded, but unmistakably clear. In its implications, she had observed unusual family dynamics that warranted further investigation before any final decisions were made about my guardianship. Her recommendation for a deeper, more independent medical evaluation conducted by physicians not selected by my family created an unexpected delay in what had been their confident march toward absolute legal control. The judge, responding to Patricia's concerns and perhaps recognizing the potential liability of approving guardianship based on potentially tainted evidence, ordered a more comprehensive assessment that would include input from multiple sources and greater scrutiny of my actual condition versus the condition described by my family's hand-picked experts. The effect of this intervention on my family was immediate and dramatic. Their faces, which had carried expressions of confident anticipation throughout the earlier proceedings, suddenly contorted with barely concealed panic as they realized that their carefully constructed legal strategy was facing unexpected challenges from a source they hadn't anticipated or prepared for. William's jaw tightened with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was calculating how much damage this delay might cause to their timeline for gaining complete control over my assets and situation. Margaret's composure slipped just enough to reveal the calculating coldness that had always lurked beneath her performance of concerned family care. Their confidence in the inevitability of their victory was shaken for the first time since they had begun their campaign to silence me. Despite this unexpected intervention and the possibility that it might lead to genuine scrutiny of my situation, I felt no surge of hope or triumph. The temporary victory felt hollow and uncertain, overshadowed by the knowledge of how thoroughly they had already compromised my mental faculties and how limited my ability was to communicate coherently with investigators who might not understand the significance of what I was trying to tell them. The legal maneuvers and court proceedings felt like watching my own funeral from a distance, a formal process that would determine the fate of someone who bore my name, but who had been so fundamentally altered by months of psychological torture that I sometimes wondered if the woman they were discussing in their legal documents still existed in any meaningful way. Even if Patricia's intervention led to more thorough investigation, even if some authority figure eventually discovered the evidence I had hidden, I understood that the damage to my mind and body might be irreversible. The real Gloria, the woman who had carried a terrible secret for 4 decades while maintaining her essential humanity and moral compass, was disappearing piece by piece, with each passing day replaced by a confused shadow who could barely remember why the truth had once seemed so important to preserve. The unexpected intervention by the court-appointed social worker had clearly rattled my family's confidence in their ability to achieve total legal control through their original timeline. But rather than backing down or reconsidering their approach, they responded with the desperate intensity of people who understood that their entire strategy depended on silencing me before anyone could seriously investigate my claims or discover the evidence I had hidden. Their final attempt at manipulation took the form of what appeared to be a genuine family reconciliation, orchestrated with the same careful attention to detail they had brought to every other aspect of their campaign to control my narrative. William and Margaret arrived at my house, carrying photo albums and mementos from happier times, their expressions carefully crafted to convey the kind of loving concern that might convince observers they were simply trying to comfort a confused elderly relative. William's performance was particularly masterful, his voice trembling with what seemed like genuine emotion as he sat beside my bed and spread old photographs across the coverlet. pictures of family vacations and holiday celebrations, images from my wedding and his childhood documentation of all the moments when our family bonds had seemed real and unbreakable, rather than the facade I now understood them to have always been. "Gloria, please," he pleaded, tears gathering in his eyes, with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. "Look at these pictures. Look at all the wonderful memories we've shared together. We're doing this because we love you, because we want to protect you from getting confused and upset about things that happened so long ago they don't matter anymore." His words were designed to appeal to whatever remained of my emotional connection to our shared history, to remind me of the times when I had believed in the bonds of family loyalty that had motivated my decades of silence about our crime. He spoke about the damage that would be caused if I continued to insist on discussing old stories that nobody needs to hear, painting my desire for confession as a form of selfishness that would hurt innocent family members who had nothing to do with events that had occurred before some of them were even born. Margaret joined his performance with her own carefully modulated expressions of concern, her voice carrying the kind of patient sadness that suggested she was dealing with a beloved family member whose mental deterioration was causing pain for everyone involved. She spoke about the stress my accusations were causing the younger generation, the confusion I was creating by insisting on talking about things that never really happened the way you remember them. Their tag team approach was sophisticated and emotionally manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for the pain my insistence on truth-telling was supposedly causing people who had never asked to be burdened with the consequences of actions they hadn't committed. They positioned themselves as the reasonable, loving family members who were simply trying to protect everyone from the unnecessary trauma of relitigating ancient history that had no bearing on current reality. But as I listened to their carefully rehearsed appeals, struggling to process their words through the pharmaceutical fog that clouded my thinking, something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of who these people really were and what our relationships had actually meant throughout the decades I had spent protecting them. In that moment of flickering clarity that occasionally broke through the chemical restraints they had placed on my consciousness, I could see them with startling objectivity, not as the family members I had loved and sacrificed for, but as the calculating manipulators. They had always been people who had spent their entire lives taking advantage of my willingness to prioritize their welfare over my own peace of mind. The tears in William's eyes were real enough, but they weren't tears of love or concern for my well-being. They were tears of frustration and fear, the emotional response of someone who was losing control of a situation he had believed was firmly under his management. His appeals to family loyalty were desperate attempts to maintain a dynamic that had served his interests for decades, not expressions of genuine affection for the woman who had carried his secrets at enormous personal cost. Margaret's expressions of concern were equally hollow, performed with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing caring while actually serving her own agenda. Her worry about the stress my revelations might cause was really anxiety about the social and financial consequences they would face if the truth about our family's covered-up crime ever became public knowledge. Though I could no longer speak coherently enough to articulate my thoughts in words they would understand, my silence became its own form of communication. I looked at them with eyes that held a quiet, unwavering gaze of knowing, a recognition that transcended the pharmaceutical barriers they had erected around my ability to think and speak clearly. My silence was my answer to their manipulative appeals, a profound and sorrowful detachment that acknowledged their desperate attempt to reclaim control while definitively rejecting any possibility of returning to the old dynamic where my conscience could be subordinated to their comfort. The bond between us wasn't just damaged, it was irrevocably broken, tainted beyond any possibility of repair by their willingness to destroy my mind, rather than face the consequences of our shared guilt. After they left their performance, having failed to achieve its intended effect, the brief clarity that had allowed me to see them so objectively began to fade, replaced by the familiar fog of confusion and disorientation that had become my normal state of consciousness. Yet even as my thoughts became scattered and fragmented once again, a phantom ache remained in my chest, a deep sadness that seemed to exist independent of my ability to think clearly about its source. Through the haze of my drugged consciousness, I glimpsed fleeting images of a different life, an alternate reality where our family had chosen honesty over deception in the aftermath of that terrible accident 43 years ago. I saw myself confessing our crime, immediately accepting whatever legal and social consequences might have followed, building relationships based on truth rather than shared complicity in covering up an innocent person's death. In this imagined alternative, I was a woman who had aged with peace in her heart rather than the constant torment of unconfessed guilt. My family members were people who had learned to live with difficult truths rather than constructing elaborate lies to avoid facing the consequences of their actions. We were bound together by genuine love and mutual respect, rather than the toxic dynamics of secrecy and manipulation that had actually defined our relationships. But these visions of what might have been felt more like torture than comfort reminders of all the ways our family could have chosen differently if any of us had possessed the courage to prioritize truth over reputation. The life that could have existed, built on honesty and redemption rather than deception and continued victimization, now lay shattered beyond any possibility of reconstruction. As my mental decline continued and my ability to resist their control diminished further, my family gradually abandoned their direct psychological manipulation in favor of a more straightforward approach focused entirely on managing my physical environment and public presentation. Their visits became less frequent and more perfunctory, their feigned expressions of concern replaced by the cold efficiency of people managing a problem rather than caring for a loved one. This shift in their approach, while born of frustration with their inability to make me cooperate with their narrative, brought with it an unexpected mercy. The constant emotional manipulation and gaslighting that had been so psychologically devastating were replaced by simple neglect, which felt almost peaceful by comparison. Their absence from my daily routine allowed for a measure of quiet that I hadn't experienced since their campaign against me had begun. The symbolic severance was complete, not because I had chosen to cut ties with them, but because they had finally revealed themselves so completely that even my compromised mind could no longer maintain any illusions about their true nature. They had chosen to prioritize their comfort over my welfare, their reputation over my right to seek redemption, their convenience over my fundamental humanity. As I lay in my bed during the long, empty hours that now defined my existence, I felt a strange kind of peace settling over me, despite the ongoing chemical assault on my consciousness. I had done what I could to preserve the truth for whatever future might discover it. Whether that evidence would ever be found, whether anyone would believe it if they did find it, whether justice would ever be served, all of that was beyond my control now. The ties that had bound me to my family for over 7 decades had been severed, not by my choice, but by their actions, not through anger, but through the simple recognition that some relationships cannot survive the weight of what people are willing to do to each other in service of their own interests. My quiet decline continued with the inexorable progression of someone whose mind and body had been systematically weakened by months of pharmaceutical abuse and psychological torture. The medications had taken their cumulative toll, leaving me in a state of perpetual confusion, where clear thoughts emerged only occasionally, like glimpses of sunlight breaking through persistent storm clouds. But the independent medical evaluation that Patricia Williams had recommended, along with her detailed social worker's report, had become part of the public guardianship records documents that were accessible to attorneys, medical professionals, and other officials who worked within the system designed to protect vulnerable adults. These reports contained language that was carefully worded, but unmistakably damning in its implications about my family's manipulative control and the suspicious circumstances surrounding my rapid mental decline. While no direct public expose of our decades-old crime had occurred, Patricia's documentation had planted seeds of doubt that began growing in unexpected places. The medical professionals who reviewed my case noted the unusual pattern of my deterioration, the way my confusion seemed to worsen dramatically whenever family members were present, the suspicious timing of my decline coinciding with my attempts to discuss family history, the excessive levels of medication that seemed designed to suppress cognitive function rather than treat any identifiable medical condition. Whispers began circulating within the legal community about the unusual circumstances surrounding Gloria Morrison's guardianship case. Attorneys who specialized in elder abuse started discussing my situation during professional conferences, using it as an example of how families could manipulate the legal system to silence inconvenient relatives. The case study that emerged from my suffering highlighted tactics that other predatory family members might use to control elderly relatives who possess damaging information. These professional discussions gradually spread beyond the legal community to include medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officials who dealt with elder abuse cases. My situation became a cautionary tale that was shared in training seminars and professional development workshops, a real-world example of how sophisticated psychological manipulation could be disguised as loving family care. The growing awareness of my case cast an increasingly long shadow over my family's previously impeccable reputation within our community. While no one was making direct accusations about criminal behavior, the simple fact that the Morrison family was being discussed in professional circles as an example of potential elder abuse was devastating to the carefully constructed image they had spent decades building and protecting. My family's response to this subtle but persistent scrutiny revealed the depth of their investment in maintaining appearances over addressing the actual harm they had caused. Rather than reconsidering their treatment of me or acknowledging that their methods might have been excessive, they doubled down on their narrative about my mental illness and their own victimization by a system that failed to appreciate their sacrifices in caring for a difficult relative. Williams' business relationships began showing signs of strain as colleagues and clients became aware of the controversy surrounding his family's treatment of his elderly sister. Professional associates who had once sought his financial advice started declining invitations to social events and quietly transferring their accounts to other firms. The whispered concerns about his character and judgment, while never explicitly stated, created an atmosphere of uncertainty that was toxic to a profession built on trust and reputation. Margaret's position in various charitable organizations became similarly compromised as board members and volunteers began questioning whether someone involved in questionable treatment of an elderly family member should be entrusted with responsibility for vulnerable populations served by their charities. Her contributions and expertise were no longer enough to offset the growing concerns about her moral character. The younger generation, my arrogant nieces and nephews who had participated so eagerly in my psychological torture, found their inherited social standing subtly but persistently undermined by the rumors that followed them through professional and social circles. Their parents' reputation for ruthless ambition, once admired as evidence of successful family values, was now viewed with suspicion and distaste by people who wondered what other cruel behaviors might be hidden beneath their polished facades. The social exile my family experienced was not dramatic or sudden. There were no confrontational scenes or public denunciations that might have allowed them to defend themselves or counterattack their accusers. Instead, they faced the slow, relentless erosion of their social capital through 1,000 small slights invitations that stopped coming business opportunities that went to competitors, social conversations that grew awkward and stilted when they approached. Their perfect image was being tarnished not by any single dramatic revelation, but by the gradual recognition that their treatment of me revealed character flaws that made them unsuitable companions for people who valued integrity and compassion. The very reputation they had been so desperate to protect through their campaign of silence was being destroyed by the methods they had chosen to preserve it. Amidst this shifting tide of public opinion, something remarkable was happening to my own situation that I was only dimly aware of through the fog of my medicated consciousness. The compassionate social workers and medical professionals who had become involved in my case were ensuring that I received genuine care and small kindnesses that acknowledged my personhood beyond the difficult patient label my family had constructed. A new team of caregivers, selected and supervised by the court-appointed advocates rather than my family, began treating me with the dignity and respect that had been absent from my life for so many months. They spoke to me as if my thoughts and feelings mattered, even when I couldn't respond coherently. They provided comfort measures designed to ease my suffering rather than control my behavior. These professionals recognized the signs of someone who had endured systematic abuse, and while they couldn't reverse the damage that had been done to my mind and body, they could ensure that my remaining time was marked by genuine human compassion rather than calculated cruelty. Their quiet, respectful care became a form of vindication, proof that my suffering had been recognized and that my inherent worth as a human being was being honored despite my family's attempts to reduce me to a problem to be managed. Yet despite this partial recognition of the injustice I had endured, despite the subtle but growing acknowledgement that I had been wronged by people who should have protected me, a profound sense of isolation continued to define my existence. The pharmaceutical damage to my cognitive abilities was largely irreversible, leaving me trapped in a confusion that made meaningful communication impossible, even when I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my welfare. The partial justice that was emerging through professional channels felt hollow when measured against the magnitude of what I had lost, not just my mental faculties and my remaining years, but any hope of the spiritual peace that might have come from confessing our family's secret while I still possessed the ability to speak coherently about its significance. My truth was beginning to be understood by a few people who mattered within the systems designed to protect vulnerable adults, but my heart remained marked by the knowledge that I would probably die with our crime unconfessed and my conscience unrelieved. The ultimate peace of absolution, the spiritual release I had sought by attempting to tell the truth, remained as elusive as ever, despite the growing recognition that I had been systematically victimized by my own family. In what would prove to be my final months, my existence had been reduced to the confines of my bedroom, but within that limited space, something approaching peace began to emerge through the genuine care provided by the new team of professionals who had taken responsibility for my welfare. These compassionate individuals understood that my value as a human being wasn't diminished by my inability to think clearly or communicate effectively. The court-appointed caregivers brought small touches of beauty and comfort into my diminished world that felt like acts of grace after months of deliberate psychological cruelty. A single potted plant appeared on my windowsill, a small African violet with delicate purple blooms that someone watered faithfully and positioned to catch the morning sunlight. The simple act of having something alive and growing in my room felt like a miracle after the sterile institutional atmosphere my family had created. Soft music began playing during my waking hours, not the harsh sounds of television programs chosen for their sedating effects, but gentle melodies that seemed selected for their ability to soothe and comfort rather than control. Sometimes I would hear hymns from my childhood songs that carried memories of simpler times when faith felt like comfort rather than condemnation. Other times, there were instrumental pieces that seemed to wrap around my confused thoughts like warm blankets. The new caregivers spoke to me as if my responses mattered, maintaining conversations even when I could only offer fractured words or confused gestures in return. They would describe the weather outside my window, share observations about the changing seasons, read short passages from books they thought might interest me. Their voices carried warmth and respect that had been absent from my interactions with family members and their hired staff. These small mercies became the foundation of what could generously be called my new life, an existence built around the recognition that comfort and dignity were possible even in the most constrained circumstances. The professional caregivers understood that their role wasn't to cure my condition or restore my former capabilities, but simply to ensure that my remaining time was marked by as much peace and kindness as possible. Yet even within this environment of genuine care, the crushing weight of the decades-long secret and my family's monstrous betrayal remained a constant presence in the corners of my fading consciousness. There were moments when the pharmaceutical fog would lift just enough for me to remember with startling clarity the full scope of what I had endured and why I had suffered the innocent life that had been lost, the truth that had been buried, the price I had paid for my family's determination to avoid consequences. During these brief periods of mental clarity, the full agony of my situation would wash over me like a tide of grief and rage and helpless despair. I would remember the young woman who had died in our family's crime, see her face as clearly as if the accident had happened yesterday rather than 4 decades ago. I would feel the weight of her family's unanswered questions, their right to know the truth about what had happened to their daughter's sister friend. The knowledge that I would likely die with this secret unconfessed felt like a spiritual wound that no amount of physical comfort could heal. My family's systematic destruction of my ability to speak coherently about the past had robbed me not just of my mental faculties, but of my chance for the redemption that might have come from finally telling the truth and accepting whatever consequences followed. These moments of painful clarity were interspersed with longer periods when my thoughts dissolved into fragments that I couldn't hold together long enough to form coherent understanding. The medications and the cumulative effects of months of psychological torture had created a permanent haze through which reality filtered in disconnected pieces, a caregiver's gentle touch, the sound of rain against my window, the scent of flowers from the plant someone had brought me. But even in my most confused states, I was somehow aware that the atmosphere around me had changed from one of deliberate cruelty to one of genuine compassion. The people who cared for me now weren't following instructions designed to break my spirit or cloud my thinking. They were simply trying to provide whatever comfort was possible for someone whose mind and body had been severely damaged by systematic abuse. These small joys that emerged in my final months felt precious, precisely because they had been so completely absent during the worst of my family's campaign against me. The gentle touch of a caregiver's hand when she helped me drink water or adjusted my pillows. The warmth of afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that were no longer kept shuttered to maintain my isolation. The sound of genuine laughter from staff members who weren't performing their concern for the benefit of observers. Such moments of contentment existed alongside my persistent grief, rather than replacing it, creating a complex emotional landscape where sorrow and peace could coexist without canceling each other out. They proved that even as my life was ending, even as my mind continued its slow retreat from coherent thought, quiet moments of human connection and simple beauty could still provide meaning. Through the networks of professional gossip that connected social workers, attorneys, and medical personnel throughout our region, I occasionally became aware that my family's social standing continued its steady decline. The whispers about their treatment of me had evolved into more direct conversations about character and values, discussions that made their presence unwelcome in circles where they had once been respected and sought after. Business relationships that had taken decades to build dissolved as colleagues and clients found reasons to distance themselves from people whose moral character had become questionable. Social invitations that had once been automatic stopped arriving as hosts realized that the Morrison family's presence would make other guests uncomfortable. The very legacy they had been so desperate to protect through their campaign to silence me was being undermined by the methods they had chosen to preserve it. Their wealth remained largely intact, but their reputation, the social capital that had made that wealth meaningful in terms of status and influence, was being systematically destroyed by their own actions. Yet these reports of their comeuppance brought me no satisfaction or sense of vindication. Their suffering felt separate from my healing proof that justice sometimes emerges through natural consequences rather than deliberate intervention, but not a source of comfort for someone whose own losses could never be restored or replaced. As autumn gave way to winter and my physical condition continued its inevitable decline, I found myself existing in a strange state of acceptance that felt different from anything I had experienced during my long life. The fighting was over, not because I had won or lost, but because I had reached the limits of what was possible within the constraints of my damaged mind and failing body. In the depths of winter, as my body grew weaker and my periods of mental clarity became increasingly rare and brief, something extraordinary began happening in the twilight hours when the boundary between waking and sleeping became fluid and uncertain. Through the pharmaceutical haze that had clouded my thinking for so many months, memories began surfacing with startling vividness, not the confused fragments that usually constituted my recollections, but complete detailed scenes from the distant past. One particular memory, emerged with such crystal clarity that it felt more real than my immediate surroundings, the face of the young woman who had died in our family's crime 43 years earlier. I could see her as she had appeared in the newspaper photographs that had run after the accident before we had successfully convinced the authorities to accept our fabricated version of events. She had been 22 years old, a graduate student working part-time at the local library to help pay for her education, someone with dreams and plans and people who loved her. Her name had been Catherine Miller, though we had trained ourselves never to speak it aloud in the decades that followed. She had been walking home from her evening shift at the library when our family's reckless behavior had cut her life short, transforming her from a living person with hopes and fears and unfinished conversations into a secret we carried like poison in our hearts. As this memory crystallized in my fading consciousness, I felt something that had been absent throughout all my months of suffering, a sense of quiet release, as if some burden I had been carrying was finally being acknowledged and perhaps partially lifted. It wasn't forgiveness. I understood that forgiveness would require confession and accountability that I would never be able to provide. But it was recognition, a final acknowledgement of the debt I owed to someone whose death had never been properly mourned or honestly explained. In that moment of profound clarity, I felt the familiar ache in my heart for the life I had lived, the truth I had longed to confess, and the family that had ultimately betrayed me rather than face the consequences of our shared guilt. But this time, instead of fighting against these feelings or trying to transform them into something more manageable, I simply allowed the sorrow to exist as it was profound, permanent, and honest. The grief I felt wasn't just for Catherine Miller, though her loss remained the center of everything that had gone wrong in our family's moral life. I also mourned for the woman I might have been if I had found the courage to confess our crime immediately, for the peace I might have known if I had chosen truth over family loyalty, for the relationships that might have been possible if we had built our bonds on honesty rather than shared complicity in covering up an innocent person's death. But as I lay in my bed, feeling the winter wind rattle the windows and listening to the gentle voices of caregivers who treated me with kindness despite my inability to respond coherently, I began to understand something that had eluded me throughout decades of guilt and the recent months of torture. True peace wasn't necessarily about achieving perfect justice or complete restoration of what had been lost. True peace might instead be about accepting what was acknowledging the full weight of what had happened without being destroyed by it, finding a way to carry impossible burdens with whatever grace was available. The spiritual release I had sought through confession might have been the ideal outcome, but it wasn't the only path toward the kind of acceptance that could allow a soul to rest. This quiet acceptance brought with it a deeper level of tranquility than I had experienced since the accident that had changed everything. I realized that my worth as a human being wasn't determined solely by my ability to achieve perfect redemption or complete honesty about the past. I had carried a terrible secret for 43 years, but I had also lived a life that contained love and sacrifice and moments of genuine goodness alongside the overwhelming guilt. My physical body was failing, and my mind was retreating further into confusion with each passing day. But my spirit was finding a kind of liberation in this final acceptance of complexity, the understanding that people could be simultaneously guilty and innocent, that love could coexist with betrayal, that peace was possible even when justice remained incomplete. As my breathing became more labored and my periods of consciousness grew shorter, I felt something approaching gratitude for for the small acts of grace that had marked my final months. The caregivers who had treated me with dignity when my family had stolen that dignity away. The social worker who had recognized my suffering and intervened when intervention seemed impossible. The simple human kindness that had emerged in the darkest period of my life, proving that compassion could survive even in circumstances designed to destroy it. My last fully coherent thought was about the package I had hidden in the old photo album, the dead drop, that represented my final act of defiance against my family's campaign to silence me forever. I couldn't know whether that evidence would ever be discovered, whether anyone would believe it if they found it, whether the truth about Catherine Miller's death would ever be properly acknowledged. But I had done what was possible within the constraints of my situation. I had preserved the truth in a form that might survive, even if I could not ensuring that some record would remain of what had actually happened and who was responsible for both the original crime and the decades of cover-up that had followed. As consciousness faded and the boundaries between memory and present reality dissolved completely, I felt a profound sense of completion, not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because I had finally reached the end of a long, difficult journey with my essential humanity intact, despite everything that had been done to destroy it. My last breath was a gentle sigh, a quiet release that came not from victory or defeat, but from simple exhaustion and the recognition that some battles end not in triumph, but in acceptance. The truth I had carried for so many years would have to find its own way into the world now, through whatever providence or accident might bring my hidden evidence to light. Though I would not witness it, my meticulously placed dead drop within the antique photo album would eventually be discovered by a distant cousin who had been asked to help clear out my belongings after my death. Rachel, the family member who had always questioned our official story about Catherine Miller's death, would recognize the significance of what she found and ensure that it reached people who could act on the information it contained. My truth would finally see daylight, though I would not be there to experience the vindication or witness the consequences for those who had tried so hard to keep it buried. The resilience I had shown wasn't about conquering my enemies or achieving perfect justice. It was about enduring impossible circumstances while preserving something essential about who I was and what I believed, ensuring that truth would ultimately be heard even if I could no longer speak it myself. My earthly life ended not in the peaceful confession and reconciliation I had yearned for, but in quiet solitude, marked by the profound transformation of someone who had carried an unbearable burden for 43 years before being systematically destroyed by the very people she had sacrificed everything to protect. The woman who drew her final breath bore little resemblance to the confident family matriarch who had once believed that love and loyalty could overcome any moral challenge. It was not the ending I had hoped for, not the spiritual peace that might have come from honest confession, not the family reconciliation that might have followed forgiveness, not the public acknowledgement of Catherine Miller's true story that might have provided some measure of justice for her memory. Instead, it was an ending carved from immense suffering and monstrous betrayal shaped by the pharmaceutical abuse and psychological torture that had stolen my final years and left me unable to speak the truths that had tormented my conscience. Yet even in that constrained and damaged conclusion to my life, there had been touches of genuine human kindness that defied the darkness my family had created around me. The compassionate caregivers who had treated me with dignity during my final months, the social workers who had recognized my suffering and intervened when intervention seemed impossible, the simple acts of grace that had provided comfort when comfort seemed beyond reach. All of these represented small victories of human decency over calculated cruelty. I was profoundly changed by what I had endured, marked by scars that went deeper than any physical injury could reach. The decades of carrying our family's secret had shaped every major decision of my adult life, while the systematic abuse I suffered in my final years had stripped away much of what I had once considered essential to my identity. Yet something fundamental had survived intact: the moral conviction that had driven me to seek confession, the spiritual strength that had allowed me to preserve evidence for future discovery, the essential humanity that no amount of pharmaceutical manipulation could completely destroy. These invisible scars had defined the agonizing battle for my right to speak the truth, a battle that was lost in practical terms, but won in ways that transcended immediate victory or defeat. My spirit, though battered and worn down by years of impossible moral weight and months of deliberate torture, had ultimately triumphed through one quiet final act of defiance that ensured my voice would eventually be heard, however faintly, from beyond the grave. Life had taught me that some secrets create wounds that demand confession, that the fear of damaged reputation can drive even those closest to us to commit acts of breathtaking cruelty, that the bonds we believe to be unbreakable can be severed by people willing to prioritize their comfort over our fundamental humanity. I learned that families can become conspiracies, that love can be weaponized, that the very people who benefit from our sacrifices may ultimately be willing to destroy us to protect those benefits. But I also learned that truth possesses a resilience that outlasts the people who try to bury it, that human dignity can survive even systematic attempts to destroy it, that small acts of genuine kindness can provide profound comfort even in the darkest circumstances. True peace, I discovered, isn't always found in perfect endings or complete justice, but sometimes in the quiet strength that allows us to preserve what matters most, even when we cannot live to see its ultimate vindication. Some wounds never truly heal, leaving permanent reminders of the battles we have survived and the prices we have paid for our convictions. But sometimes that quiet strength, that enduring echo of a whispered truth, finally preserved for future discovery, is enough to transform even the most constrained ending into something that honors both the suffering endured and the essential humanity that persisted despite every attempt to destroy it.